Alright, so I've got a few weird things to get through. This is a usual monthly wrap-up of things that I've read, but I don't have any of the things that I've read with me because I packed them all up in my suitcase, or I gave them to charity, or I sent them into storage. I did lots of different things with a lot of different books, so I'm just going to try and remember what I read. Also, I didn't read a lot this month because I've been incredibly stressed. I've put out fewer videos than normal. I'm not doing very well mental health-wise. I've covered this in other videos, you can go watch those. And I don't know if you can hear that, but I'm with Snowy. I gave Snowy to my friend Jen and her husband Theo. And I'm at their house right now, which means I get to be reunited with Snowy for the next few days until I fly to Japan. I had to leave my home, my flight was delayed, I needed somewhere to stay, and so I'm with Jen and Snowy. I think that's everything. What the hell did I read? I started off the month by reading The Doll Factory by Elizabeth McNeil. I mentioned that in my video on Gothic literature. In that video I talked about the fact that it's not Gothic, and I argued why, so you can go watch that. But it's a really lovely piece of British historical fiction. I read her other second novel, Circus of Wonders, quite a while ago and did a dedicated review of that. And I really enjoyed Circus of Wonders. I thought it was a lovely book. And I do think that The Doll Factory is a little bit better. I enjoyed the characters, the setting, the story, all of the different pieces more than I did Circus of Wonders, which was surprising to me because I love the idea of a circus setting, especially in the Victorian period. And I think Circus of Wonders has more beautiful prose, and I really remarked on that in my video. But the characters and story beats and the fact that there's just this very delicious villain character, all of that in The Doll Factory just spoke to me a lot more. The Doll Factory is very much about three distinct characters, a woman and two men, in what one of them thinks is probably a love triangle but is very much not. And it's got a really lovely appreciation of art. It focuses on painting, it focuses on doll making, as the title suggests, and it just really enjoys art and looking at the way that art was viewed and made and the people who did make it during the Victorian period. It's a really charming and sweet novel, and as I said, the fact that it has quite a unhinged villain character is just a lot of fun. I went up to Edinburgh a few weeks ago, and on my way up there and back down from there, I read Gideon the Ninth. Gideon the Ninth is the first in a trilogy by Tamsin Muir. I'm not sure how you pronounce her last name, I'm sorry. She's a Kiwi writer who I believe currently lives in Oxford, UK. And it is space fantasy. It's one of those things where it's very obviously a fantasy series, but it's set in space on different planets. Kind of like Dune. You know, Dune kind of crosses over fantasy and sci-fi, as does Star Wars, and as does this. Gideon the Ninth is the story of lesbian necromancers in space. That's the best way to sum it up. It's YA, kind of. It is a YA story in terms of its dialogue and its characters. There's a lot of teenage angsty edginess involved. But in terms of the way that the prose is written, the narrator's voice, the events that happen, it doesn't really feel like YA. It feels more like adult fantasy. So it's got this really weird amalgamation of these two different tones, because ultimately when you look at fantasy, the difference between YA and adult fantasy, apart from things like, I guess, sex, blood, gore, whatever, politics maybe, it's also just tone. Quite often YA stories have characters that are written in just the most annoying, edgy, teenage kind of a way. And that's what you've got here, but it is also very much adult fantasy. It's very camp and silly, but it's also very dark and gritty. There's a lot to love about it. I really, really enjoyed it, and it's weird to read pages and pages of prose that feel very, very grounded and dark and nuanced, and some really clever, subtle, heavy politics going on, only for a character to say something that is jarringly edgy, to the point that I just really enjoyed it and laughed along with the characters as they spoke, as they interacted, as they bantered and hated each other. And there is a lot of hate in this book. It's about a space empire made up of 9 or 10 different planets, and there's immortality and godhood and necromancy, and everyone is very much obsessed with tombs and skulls and skeletons and dead things. And it's about a teenage girl who was born into a life of servitude on the kind of most overlooked planet that none of the rest really care about, and the princess of that planet is taken to a tournament with all of the other leaders of all of the other planets to do a kind of contest, and our protagonist, Gideon, is her sword. She is the right-hand man of this princess, and the two of them hate each other, and they go to this contest together as a duo. It's really a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed my time with it, but as I said, the weird edginess mixed with the more grounded political heaviness of it is weird, and that's kind of why I liked it so much, apart from the setting and all of the skeletons and lesbians and stuff. Also, while I was in Edinburgh, I bought Jenny Fagan's newest novella, Hex. Hex is a very heartfelt little novella. It tells the story of a woman who I believe was real, a Scottish woman about 500 years ago, who is in a jail cell through the night beneath the streets of Edinburgh. And in the morning, she will wake up and she will be hanged for the crime of witchcraft. But she is visited in her cell by a magic woman from now, a woman who has somehow sort of cast a spell to take herself back, and she's going to keep this witch company through the night until she eventually is hanged. And it's the two of them just kind of connecting as women. It's beautifully written. It's quite surreal because the modern woman who's going back in time, you're not exactly sure who or what she is, but it doesn't really matter. It's not really about that. It's just this conversation between two women, half a millennium apart from each other, who are still going through the same kinds of things, fighting for women's rights, fighting for equality, fighting to be respected, fighting to not be persecuted and hated and pressured, and all of the other things that women in the world today still are on a daily basis. And so it's not a happy book, it's not a nice book, but it certainly points out just how far we still have to go in the fight for true feminism. Unfortunately, one thing that made me a little bit nervous at first is the focus on witches right now is a very turfy thing in the UK, and I was a little bit worried that Jenny Fagan would turn out to be a turf, so I did some digging on Twitter, and she very much is not, so I was very relieved about that. You talk about feminism and witches in this country right now, and you think turfs, but no, thankfully. Jenny Fagan's a great writer. It's a very heavy book. It's only 100 pages long, and it'll stay with me for a long, long time. Another book that I did a dedicated video on was the only new book of this month that I ended up reviewing, which was Kyung-Suk Shin's Violets, translated by Anton Her. This was an incredible piece of Korean feminist literature. I don't think I'm going to focus on it at all here in this video. Just go watch my review of it. I had a lot to say, and towards the end of that video I get pretty angry and upset because the book really focuses on the male gaze and the way that it is so subtle, almost invisible, that it just pisses you off even more. But again, go watch that video. Violets is an incredible piece of Korean fiction. Kyung-Suk Shin is the queen of Korean literature, and you can see why when you read Violets. I also read 2 poetry collections, which was the last video before this one that I did and talked about. These 2 poetry collections were Time is a Mother, the second poetry collection by Ocean Vuong, and Limbic by Peter Scalpello. Both of these are queer poets. One collection is more focused on queerness than the other, but both of them have helped me out a lot recently while I've been struggling a little bit with my mental and physical health in the lead up to my entire life changing and me getting very stressed and frightened. Even though it's all my plan and my idea, it's still really, really scary. And these 2 poetry collections just help to ground me a little bit, make me feel something, and to be honest, I've always struggled with poetry. I've gone back and forth. There's some poets I love, a lot of poets I just don't understand, and I can get very intimidated by poetry, which I think is true for so many of us. But these 2 poetry collections came to me at the right moment, spoke to me in the right way, and made me feel what I needed to feel, and they did a really, really great job of kind of saving me from myself during this month of tumultuous heaviness. One book that I read very recently that I haven't talked about anywhere was Night Shift by Kira Ladner. I think Kira is how you pronounce her name. Sorry if it isn't. This was a very, very powerful novel that really reminded me of the works of Melissa Broder, whom I am a huge fan of. Melissa Broder is American, and Kira Ladner's novel is set in London, and as a result, although it feels very Melissa Broder, just by virtue of being set in London, especially a London of the late 90s, it feels a lot more gritty, gnarly, nasty, and I guess punk. I use punk a lot in these videos, but it does feel a little more punk. Melissa Broder's books are gross and they're full of unlikable people, but there's still this sense of polish just because they're set in California. Night Shift is, as I said, set in the late 90s, and it's about a young woman who moves from Telford to London. If you don't know where Telford is, it's actually really close to where I grew up, and it was so weird seeing Telford mentioned in a book, because Telford is not a town anyone's ever heard of. The protagonist is South African, and when she's in London working a night shift at this job, she meets this sexy French-speaking Belgian woman, and the two of them form a quick friendship. Our protagonist is straight, as far as she knows. She's in a relationship with a guy called Graham, and yet she is falling into a rabbit hole of obsession with Sabine, this Belgian woman. As the story goes on, you're constantly wondering what this obsession actually is. Is it romantic? Is it sexual? Is it neither of those things? What is it exactly? And this is a book that's pretty short. It's just over 200 pages, and for that initial 200 pages, not a lot really happens. It's a pretty slow burn, but a very captivating one because of this through line of weird obsession and the fact that our protagonist is slowly unhinging herself from her own life as she goes. And in the last 50 pages, things really go nuts. In fact, if you haven't read this yet and you're interested, trigger warning for some pretty unsettling sexual abuse towards the end, which I guess is a spoiler, but trigger warnings are important. Night Shift is a very, very unsettling book at times, but it's also a very slow, thoughtful novel. I like the fact that it is literary in a very simple way. It makes you think a lot about our relationships to one another, especially between young women, but it is not pretentious in any way, especially in its language, in its dialogue. Everything feels very, very ordinary. The language is not heightened, but it is also not ridiculous and theatrical. It is just life, and it's one of those few novels where as you read it, you feel so connected to life. Because although there are moments of surrealism through the book, just by virtue of the fact that it's always set at night and the daytime doesn't really come into it because it's all about night shifts and then going out to party, going to clubs, things like that, that lends itself to a feeling of surrealism without the book being surreal at all. But all of this, again, just feels like life. You have days, entire periods of your life that feel particularly surreal. And this book very much captures that surrealism. I've had entire months or even longer periods of my life that I look back on and think that was a very surreal time in my life. And of course, surrealism is not real. And that's what this book manages to capture. And in that way, it feels very, very literary, very grounded, and very dark and difficult at times as well. I think that's all the books I read in April, which actually doesn't seem that bad considering just how stressed, anxious, depressed, and everything else I've been this month. But I did just finish this. And as soon as I finish making this video, I'm going to do a review of this. So look out for that. This is All the Lovers in the Night by Miyako Kawakami, translated by Sambat and David Boyd. If you've been around this channel for a while, you'll know that Miyako Kawakami is my joint favorite Japanese author next to Sayaka Murata. I can never pick between the two. And we've been very, very lucky the last few years to have been treated every single year, once a year, around the same time of year, to a new novel by Kawakami. Over and over again, published by Picador in the UK, translated by the same two guys, over and over again. We had Breasts and Eggs, then Heaven, now this. I have just finished it within the last hour, and it is wonderful. And I'm so glad that it's wonderful, because I expect a lot from Miyako Kawakami now, and she just doesn't let you down. I will do a full review, I am about to film that, but just quickly, I will say that this is a novel about a young modern Japanese woman. She's in her early 30s and she is battling with herself because her life is not all that interesting. She doesn't seem to want it to be that interesting, and she has a small cast of characters that kind of exist in her life or come and go through her life that encourage change in her. One makes her want to dress better or drink and go out partying. Another wants her to do more with her career. And it's kind of about a woman's relationship to femininity, to womanhood, to personhood. and how we define ourselves in society as individuals and as members of society. I also feel like she's potentially autistic coded, but that's something I'm not entirely sure about. I think I'll ramble about that a bit in my video. I'm not sure. I still have a lot of thoughts swimming in my head after reading it, but All the Lovers in the Night is a really wonderful new book by Miyako Kawakami. If you read Heaven and you were hit particularly hard by the brutality of that book, there is much less brutality in this one, except for one particular chapter. But the brutality in Heaven kind of felt like it didn't end, and I think that book was a struggle for a lot of people, myself included, but I still adored it. All the Lovers in the Night is not quite like that. Every book that she's put out has been very uniquely different from all the others, and this is no exception. That's all the books I read in April. Hopefully, a week from now, I'll be on a plane to Japan. Fingers crossed, hoping everything goes right. We'll see. Let's say everything goes right. I will make a video as soon as I land there talking about my life and just kind of a personal update. So look out for that. Subscribe for books.